In 2003, auditors at Parmalat sent a routine confirmation request to Bank of America, asking them to verify a $4.9 billion account held in the Cayman Islands. Bank of America wrote back and said the account didn't exist. The confirmation letter Parmalat had been showing auditors for years was a forgery. The $4.9 billion was fictional. And when investigators started digging deeper, they discovered the real number wasn't $4.9 billion. It was $14 billion. Gone. Hidden. Fabricated over more than a decade. This is the story of Parmalat, Europe's Enron, and one of the biggest accounting frauds in corporate history. Parmalat was founded in 1961 by Callisto Tanzi in the small Italian city of Parma. Tanzi started with a small pasteurization plant and built it into a global food empire over 4 decades. By the early 2000s, Parmalat was selling dairy products, juices, and baked goods in over 30 countries. It sponsored Formula One racing teams. It was one of Italy's most recognized brands and one of its most trusted companies. Tanzi was celebrated as one of Italy's greatest entrepreneurs. He was charming, well-connected, and deeply embedded in Italian business and political circles. His company seemed like the definition of stability. A simple, unglamorous business selling milk and yogurt that had grown steadily for 40 years. But behind the respectable image, Parmalat had been hiding a catastrophic secret for over a decade. The trouble had actually started in the early 1990s. Parmalat had been expanding aggressively, acquiring companies, entering new markets, and spending heavily on sponsorships and advertising. But the expansion was costing far more than the company was earning. Instead of slowing down or raising equity, Tanzi and his finance team started hiding the losses. They created a web of hundreds of offshore subsidiaries and shell companies across the Cayman Islands, Luxembourg, and other jurisdictions with limited regulatory oversight. Debt was moved into these entities and kept off Parmalat's main balance sheet. Fake invoices were created to generate the appearance of revenue. Fictitious assets were listed on the books to make the company appear financially healthy when it was actually drowning in debt. And for years, nobody caught it. The auditors who signed off on Parmalat's accounts, Grant Thornton and Deloitte, later faced serious questions about how they missed discrepancies of this scale for so long. Banks across Europe lent Parmalat billions based on financial statements that were almost entirely fabricated. Regulators in Italy and across the European Union failed to identify the warning signs despite years of anomalies in the company's reporting. Part of the reason it survived so long was the sheer complexity of the fraud. Parmalat had hundreds of subsidiaries in dozens of countries. Following the money required investigators to navigate multiple legal jurisdictions, languages, and regulatory frameworks simultaneously. The more complex the structure, the harder it was for any single auditor or regulator to see the complete picture. And Tanzi was careful about who he trusted. The core of the fraud was managed by a small inner circle, family members and long-serving executives who had been with the company for decades. Loyalty and silence were maintained through generous compensation and the simple fact that the company's survival depended on keeping the secret. By 2003, Parmalat needed to raise fresh capital to keep the fraud alive. It tried to issue bonds, but investors and banks were starting to ask harder questions about the company's finances. The scrutiny was increasing. And when auditors sent that routine confirmation request to Bank of America about the $4.9 billion Cayman Islands account, the account that was supposed to be the proof of Parmalat's financial strength, the response came back almost immediately. The account didn't exist. The Bank of America letterhead on the confirmation had been forged. Someone inside Parmalat had fabricated the document and presented it to auditors as real. When this was discovered in December 2003, the entire fraud unraveled almost overnight. Parmalat filed for bankruptcy on December 27, 2003, at the time the largest corporate bankruptcy in European history. The company had listed assets of approximately $8 billion on its balance sheet. The actual deficit, the gap between real assets and real liabilities, was found to be around $14 billion. Callisto Tanzi was arrested within days. He eventually admitted to diverting approximately $640 million from Parmalat to other family businesses and personal accounts. He was convicted of fraud and market manipulation and sentenced to 18 years in prison. Several other executives were also convicted. The auditing firms faced regulatory action. Multiple banks that had helped structure Parmalat's debt were investigated for their role in enabling the fraud. Remarkably, Parmalat survived. The company went through restructuring, emerged from bankruptcy, and was eventually relisted on the Italian stock exchange. It was later acquired by the French dairy company Lactalis and continues to operate today, selling the same milk and yogurt under the same brand that Tanzi built, decades after the fraud that nearly destroyed it. The Parmalat story raises uncomfortable questions that go beyond one company or one man. How does a fraud of this scale survive for over a decade? How do auditors sign off on accounts year after year without identifying $14 billion in missing money? How do banks lend billions to a company whose finances are almost entirely fictional? The answer is always the same. Complexity conceals. Reputation protects. And when a company is large enough, trusted enough, and connected enough, the people who are supposed to ask hard questions often find reasons not to. Parmalat wasn't brought down by a regulator doing their job or an auditor asking the right question. It was brought down by a routine confirmation letter that came back with the wrong answer. Sometimes the biggest frauds in history end not with a dramatic investigation, but with a simple piece of paper that says, "This account doesn't exist." Subscribe for more corporate collapse stories every week. New case study coming soon.